Her name was Dr. Grace Miller. At 42, she was once a rising star in neurosurgery, sharp composed, and the youngest professor to ever lecture at the prestigious Lund School of Medicine. Her methods were meticulous, her instincts uncanny. Students remembered her for how she made brain anatomy feel like poetry. Colleagues knew her as the calm scalpel. But 10 years ago, Grace vanished from the field. No announcement, no interview. Just a closed door after one catastrophic operation. A high-risk pediatric case had gone wrong, and somehow all the blame fell on her. The full story never surfaced. Rumors did, and the whispers were enough to bury her career under shame she didn't earn. At home, the judgment was louder. Her family, long steeped in medical legacy, quietly cut her out of the picture. Her older brother, Dr. Daniel Miller, rose swiftly through the ranks after her departure, eventually claiming the role of chief of surgery at the same hospital where Grace once mentored. A title that had once been penciled next to her name. He never mentioned her. None of them did. At family dinners, her chair was left unspoken for. In conversations, her name was swapped out for the one who couldn't handle it. To them, she wasn't a pioneer. She was a ghost from the OR, the sister who failed. After the fallout at Lund, General Dr. Grace Miller didn't fight the headlines. She simply walked away. There was no press release, no formal resignation, just a quiet note on her desk and an empty chair by the morning shift. The news cycle spun its story. The once rising star in neurosurgery had failed in the operating room, and rather than face a board review, she vanished. No one corrected the story, especially not her. She took a job thousands of miles away in northern Finland, in a town so small, it didn't even have a stoplight. Just a stretch of pine forest, a frozen lake, and one narrow road in and out. There she found work at a local teaching hospital, not as a surgeon, but as a basic clinical instructor. She swapped scalpels for chalk dust. Gone were the sterile glass walls and high-tech suites of Lund. Here the windows rattled in winter winds, and sometimes the electricity flickered during lectures. Her office had a broken radiator, a chipped teacup, and a single photo, her and her students from her first year of teaching, all of them laughing her smile the smallest of all. Grace never told them who she used to be. To them, she was just Dr. Miller, reserved, exacting, endlessly prepared. Her lectures were brilliant, yes, but firm. She expected much and gave little praise. Still, she was fair, kind in quiet ways. A wool scarf folded over a chair before class soup left anonymously on a nurse's desk when the flu went around. She didn't need to be liked, but she was. And her students. They excelled. Some of them years later would make headlines. One led a surgical team that separated conjoined twins. Another developed a novel method for spinal repair. Others took leadership positions in major hospitals across Europe and the US. But in every profile, every photo op, no one mentioned Grace. Because she never asked them to. Because they never knew. She didn't attend conferences. She declined interviews. She never wrote opinion pieces for medical journals, though her students often quoted her words in theirs. Once a colleague invited her to speak at a symposium in Stockholm. She smiled, shook her head, and said softly, "I don't speak to rooms that forget so easily." She sent birthday cards to students, not to family. She had no online presence, no LinkedIn, no Twitter, no old alumni Facebook group to reconnect through. When her brother Daniel was appointed chief of surgery at Lund, the same role she'd once been groomed for, no one in the family called. No invitation was sent. Grace only heard about it through a patient's daughter who read it in a Swedish medical digest. It stung. Not because she wanted the title, but because the legacy had moved on without ever looking back. In her hometown, she became a ghost with a name people avoided. At family gatherings, weddings, birthdays, even funerals, if her name came up at all, it was in lowered voices. She had so much potential, they would say. Such a shame. But Grace had long since stopped hoping for clarity from those conversations. Instead, she built her life like a puzzle with missing pieces. Not perfect, but hers. She read poetry by candlelight, learned Finnish, took long walks near the lake where the ice cracked underfoot like thunder. On Sundays, she volunteered at the local hospice, reading Holding Hands, sitting beside strangers in their last moments. One evening, a dying woman asked her what she did before she came to town. Grace paused, then answered, "I used to hold hearts in my hands." The woman smiled faintly. "You still do, dear. Just differently now." Some nights Grace would sit at her kitchen table, old surgical textbooks still stacked nearby, untouched but not forgotten. A small box lived in the bottom drawer inside it, a photo of her surgical team, a commendation letter she never framed, and a single apology note that had never been sent. She hadn't opened the box in years, but she kept it, not out of regret, but as a quiet reminder, the truth doesn't disappear just because no one says it out loud. She never told her students about the surgery, the one that made her walk away, the one where the monitors flatlined and the hospital's lawyers moved faster than the code blue team. She never told them about the night she was called into a boardroom full of people who used to clap when she entered. Or how none of them asked her what really happened. They just handed her a letter and told her to take a break. She'd become too good at being invisible. But even in obscurity, Grace never stopped being a surgeon. She just carried her scalpel differently through words, through mentorship, through unwavering silence when others would have shouted. The world had forgotten her name, but lives were still being saved by hands she once guided. And perhaps in her quiet heart, that was enough. It came in the mail on a Wednesday, in an envelope that smelled faintly of printer ink and starch. Thick, expensive cardstock. Gold lettering pressed into a navy blue border. A hospital crest in the top corner still the same after all these years. She didn't recognize the handwriting. There was no personal note, no warm signature, just a single line printed in elegant serif. "You are cordially invited to the appointment ceremony of Dr. Lucas Raines, Chief of Neurosurgery, Lund General Hospital." Grace stared at it for a long time. It wasn't addressed to Professor Grace Miller. It didn't even say Dr. Miller. Just G. Miller Co-Hospital Records Archive, Eastern Finland Medical College. A logistics afterthought, a formality. Maybe someone in the admin remembered she once worked there, or maybe it was automated. Whatever the reason, no one from her family had sent it. Not Daniel, not her mother, not anyone, and her name nowhere on the program. Not as a former chief resident, not as a former mentor, not as the professor who trained Lucas Raines through 2 full surgical fellowships. But Grace didn't tear it up. She didn't toss it into the bin with yesterday's newspaper. She sat down at her kitchen table, the afternoon light slanting across the floorboards, and read the invitation again. Slowly. Then she placed it gently on the counter next to her keys. She didn't plan on dressing in black or walking in dramatically late. This wasn't a movie. It wasn't a revenge plot. She didn't want to be seen. She wanted to see. She wanted to know if anything she'd poured into that place had remained. If any part of her name, even whispered, still lived in the corners of those polished corridors. If the ghosts that once pushed her out remembered who they had lost. It had been 10 years. She'd taught 100 students since then, survived 4 winters that had frozen the inside of her windows, and buried a patient who'd once told her she had the hands of someone who's forgiven herself. She hadn't. Not completely. But she was close. She packed lightly a gray wool coat, 1 pair of leather shoes, and a simple navy blouse she'd worn once to a faculty meeting. It still smelled like lavender soap. Underneath it, she slid a copy of her old teaching notes from Raines's first year. Not for anyone else. Just for her. The flight to Stockholm was quiet. The train to Lund is even quieter. She passed familiar intersections that looked foreign now. Cafes that had changed names. Streets she used to cross while balancing takeout and patient charts. Outside the hospital, she stood for a moment. Just stood there, like someone visiting a childhood home that no longer belonged to them. The walls had been repainted. The glass doors still let in too much cold. And yet something in her chest ached in recognition. Not grief, not fear. Just the slow hum of return. Inside the lobby, buzzed with low voices and soft music. Families, colleagues, former alumni, everyone dressed in subtle prestige. There were no banners, just a sleek digital display that rotated through slides. Welcome, Dr. Rains, Chief of Neurosurgery, 2025. Grace didn't walk down the center aisle. She took a side seat near the back. No name tag, no reserved sign, just a small paper program folded on the chair. She opened it with deliberate hands. Her name was not there, not under the faculty roster, not in the acknowledgments, not in the legacy of mentorship slide, which listed 5 past professors. She wasn't surprised, not really, but still it stung. A small group nearby whispered about the new chief. He's brilliant, youngest in hospital history, trained under some mysterious European professor. Grace gave a faint smile. She didn't correct them. She could have. But this wasn't about reclaiming credit. It was about reclaiming her place not in their story, but in her own. From the front row, she spotted her brother Daniel. His suit was perfect. His posture polished. He didn't look back. No one from her family did. She was once again the unspoken name in a room full of names. And yet she stayed. She sat through the speeches, the slideshows, the applause. She watched Lucas Rains take the stage in a crisp white coat and bow slightly before the crowd. She noticed the way he tapped his fingers together when nervous something he picked up from her during rounds, though he likely no longer remembered why. He didn't see her, not yet, but that didn't matter. Grace breathed in the moment, let it settle in her lungs. Even uninvited, even unacknowledged, she had walked through those doors again, on her terms. And that in itself, it was a kind of beginning. The email arrived the day before the ceremony. There was no subject line, just an attachment and a one-sentence message from a burner account she didn't recognize. You may want to see what's being published tomorrow. Grace didn't open it right away. She stared at the blinking cursor for a few minutes, feeling the weight of hesitation that only comes from years of learning how not to react too quickly. Finally, curiosity overcame instinct. She clicked. It was a PDF of a leaked article scheduled for release on an anonymous medical whistleblower blog known for exposing fraud. The title was clear: Inflammatory, Breaking New Chief of Surgery at Lund, Accused of Plagiarism in Doctoral Work. Grace's chest tightened. Not because of the accusation, but because of the first line in the body of the article, Dr. Lucas Rains, newly appointed Chief of Neurosurgery at Lund. General appears to have lifted entire theoretical frameworks from unpublished teaching materials, including anonymous lecture notes from over a decade ago. Her fingers gripped the edge of the laptop. She knew those words, not in theory, not vaguely. Word for word, she remembered writing that sentence on a lecture slide, the same slide she used to explain the microvascular implications of neuroplasticity during a winter rotation in 2012. It wasn't just inspired by her teaching, it was hers. The reporter didn't name her, but they didn't need to. The notes were unmistakable to anyone who'd sat in her classroom. It was her phrasing, her diagrams, her clinical style. And yet she felt no rage. No betrayal, just something more complex. Lucas hadn't stolen it. He had studied it, absorbed it. He had taken what she taught him and folded it into his medical philosophy. Grace knew this because she remembered how diligently he asked questions, how he annotated margins with thoughts deeper than the curriculum demanded. But someone else was now using her forgotten past as ammunition, not to elevate her, but to take him down. She didn't have to guess who. Hospitals were political machines. There were always rivals. There was always someone who resented a rising star. And there was always someone watching from the sidelines, waiting for the perfect weapon to throw a buried name from the past, dust it off for the sake of sabotage. She was that weapon now, whether she consented or not. Hours later, she was summoned quietly, not by email, not by calendar, but through a discreet knock on her hotel door. It was an admin assistant from Lund, dressed in muted navy and holding a clipboard too neatly. The board would appreciate your insight on a delicate matter, she said, not quite meeting Grace's eyes. Grace followed her through a back corridor up a service elevator into a private office, where 3 people sat around a low table, a compliance officer, an ethics advisor, and a legal liaison from the hospital's governing board. They didn't accuse her. They didn't even ask directly. Instead, they slid a printed copy of the leaked article across the table, and one of them, a younger woman with an apologetic smile, said softly, "We believe you might recognize these materials. Can you confirm whether they're yours?" Grace held the paper without touching it, her eyes scanning what used to be hers, now reassembled in a different voice tied to a different man. And yet, in a strange way, she didn't feel stolen from. She felt seen, not by the institution, not by the politics, but by the echo of her influence still alive in someone else's mind. She looked up. "I won't confirm," she said quietly. "I won't deny either." The room paused, confused. The compliance officer leaned forward. "With respect, Dr. Miller, this could be important." If he plagiarized, Grace shook her head, firm but calm. "He didn't plagiarize, he learned." She folded the paper and pushed it back. "I taught him once, but he took what I gave and walked miles farther than I ever did. That's not theft, that's evolution." The ethics advisor tilted his head. "So, you're saying the work is based on your teachings. I'm saying he honored them." They looked at one another, unsure how to proceed. They wanted a soundbite, a confirmation, a clean line to pin responsibility on someone. But Grace wasn't going to be used, not to elevate herself, and not to destroy someone who had knowingly or not carried a part of her with him into the next chapter of medicine. Before she stood, she added one final line. "If your concern is that my name wasn't cited, don't be. My name's not what matters." Then she left. In the elevator down, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, not in her formal self, not the professor, or the ghost, or the daughter who vanished. Just Grace, hair pulled back, shoulders steady, and for the first time in years, her reflection looked like someone she could live with. The leak would go live the next morning. That much was inevitable. But she wouldn't be the one to validate it. She wouldn't be the one to weaponize what was once a moment of shared knowledge. Grace had spent years hidden behind silence. Now she realized that silence was hers to command, not anyone else's. This wasn't about justice in the courtroom sense. It was about the difference between revenge and remembrance. And she had made her choice. The grand hall was dressed in pride. Crisp suits, polished shoes, lapel pins glinting under golden lights. Rows of doctors, administrators, donors, and families filled the velvet chairs like pieces in a well-arranged display. Name cards, printed programs, champagne flutes that had never tasted dust. At the very back, just past the edge of notice, Grace stood still. She wore a silver-gray coat. Simple. Not formal, not casual, just clean. Her hair was swept back into a low, practiced bun. Not decorative, deliberate. Her hands rested in front of her like someone standing at the edge of something they'd once called home. Her face held no anger, no pride, only stillness like water that had learned how not to ripple. The ceremony opened with an orchestra of polite welcomes and institutional pride. A slideshow rolled through Lucas Raines's achievements, trauma innovations, surgical outcomes, community initiatives. His credentials painted the story of a man on the rise of excellence earned. Then the applause softened, and Lucas stepped up to the podium. His posture was steady, but his breath betrayed something deeper. He began thanking those who had walked beside him, mentors, former department heads, and his parents in the second row. His voice moved with the rhythm of someone used to explaining life and death through science. But then, just as he neared the end of his speech, his sentence cracked. He paused. His eyes scanned the room once, then stopped, caught on something far away. Grace didn't flinch when he saw her. She didn't shrink or smile. She simply stood, just as she had in lecture halls over a decade ago, unmoved by gaze, ready for truth. The room sensed the shift. You could feel the air harden. Lucas's hands dropped to the podium. He stepped back. And then in a move no one rehearsed, he left the stage entirely. He walked down the steps slow but sure, his eyes never leaving hers. When he reached the center aisle, he turned not toward the audience but to Grace. No spotlight followed him, no music swelled. Only his voice rose trembling, but clear enough to split the air like a scalpel. "Professor." I trained under you. The words landed with weight. What I know what saved lives this past year, it came from your lectures, from your quiet brilliance. You didn't just teach me medicine. You taught me how to think when every second mattered. You taught me how to lead when no one else would. You could hear the hum of air vents overhead, the glassware clinking somewhere in the back. But no applause followed his words. No polite laughter softened them, because this wasn't entertainment. This was truth unvarnished, unexpected, and powerful. And in that room filled with accolades, silence became the highest form of respect. Near the front, Grace's mother, the same woman who once said she never had the stomach for real surgery, slowly lowered her gaze. Not in shame, not yet, but in something dangerously close to reflection. Grace didn't move, but something in her face changed. Not a smile, just the faintest release of something she'd been holding behind her ribs for too long. Lucas continued, his voice steadier now. I didn't mention your name in my thesis, and that was a mistake. Not because you needed credit, but because I needed to remember who made this possible. You disappeared and the world forgot. But I didn't. People were now turning. Entire rows shifting to look toward the back of the room where she stood. She didn't raise her hand, didn't speak. She didn't need to. At the front row, Dr. Daniel Miller, Grace's older brother, the man who had taken her position all those years ago, sat still. His hands were clenched under the table, jaw was tightened. His eyes didn't meet hers, but his face said enough. It was the expression of a man who had thought a name could be erased by silence. But names, when earned in truth, have a way of surviving the edits. Behind him, a few members of the hospital board exchanged quick, awkward glances. They had seen Grace's name on the guest list only this morning, hastily added in ink by an intern who didn't know better. And now she was the center of the room. Lucas took one final step closer, his voice softer. You were never a failure. The system failed you. I just hope. Maybe today we started rewriting that. Then he raised his hand, not to offer a handshake, not to wave. He raised it to his temple, a formal salute, not military, but no less sacred. It was the gesture of one surgeon to another, one generation to the one that came before, one student to the teacher who changed everything even if the world had forgotten to say thank you. Grace nodded barely, and for her that was enough. A single tear clung to the corner of her mother's eye. She didn't let it fall. She never had. But she didn't look away either. And for the first time in years, Grace stood not as a ghost of a career past, not as a rumor of what might have been, but as a woman who had quietly built legacies in silence. No stage, no certificate, just the truth finally spoken aloud. And the world, or at least that room, knew her name again. Not because she demanded it, but because someone stood up and said it mattered. The hall emptied slowly after the ceremony, like a tide retreating from the shore. The champagne was still cold, the banners still perfectly straight, but the air had changed. It no longer buzzed with rehearsed applause. It held something quieter now, something like reverence. Grace didn't stay for the group photos. She had turned to leave already, halfway toward the exit, when a voice stopped her, firm but gentle. Dr. Miller. She turned. A young woman, early 30s perhaps, stood with a badge clipped to her coat and eyes that had spent more time in ORs than in social gatherings. Her voice had that slight hush one that young doctors use when they recognize they're speaking to someone they studied, not just someone they met. Ma'am, we've been reading your old papers, she said almost carefully. You weren't gone. You were just ahead of us all. Grace didn't speak at first. She simply nodded a small, measured gesture and offered a quiet smile. The kind you don't fake. The kind that says, thank you for noticing. She didn't need to say more, because when someone says a truth like that aloud, you weren't gone. You were just ahead. It echoes longer than applause ever could. By the next morning, word had spread. Not on television or social media, but in the way that mattered most. Whisper to whisper, desk to desk, operating room to operating room. Somewhere between the end of the ceremony and sunrise, the hospital's board of clinical directors had met for an unscheduled session. And by midday, they made an offer. "We would be honored," the chair said over a quiet phone call, "if you would return, not as staff, not as a performer on the surgical floor, but as a mentor, as the senior surgical educator for our most advanced residency track." Grace said nothing for a long beat. Her fingers rested against the table as she stood by her apartment window. Outside, the city moved as usual, unaware of how long a moment like this had taken to arrive. "I'll consider it," she said simply. No dramatics, no conditions. Because this time, it wasn't about proving anything. It was about choosing what mattered. 2 days later, the old walnut-paneled corridor of the hospital, the one leading to the Department of Surgery, bore a quiet, striking change. The Wall of Honor, reserved for the most distinguished contributors in the institution's 100-year history, had a familiar name reinstalled: Dr. Grace L. Miller, M.D. Fax Chair of Neurovascular Research, 2004-2013. Founder of the Clinical Ethics Lecture Series, author of Triage in Shadows. Her plaque had been removed a decade earlier, following the incident no one had dared speak of publicly. Quietly stripped from the wall, no announcement, no explanation, just gone. Now it returned restored not just in brass and wood, but in weight. That afternoon, a small group of junior residents stood before the wall reading the new edition. No one took selfies. No one whispered. They just stood still, learning who she had been, who she still was. Later that week, she walked through the surgical wing, not as a stranger anymore, but not quite as someone seeking attention either. She passed a pair of attending physicians reviewing case notes. One of them, barely older than her students in Finland, straightened when he saw her. He gave a small nod, respectful, not performative, and stepped aside without a word. Grace continued past him, her steps unhurried. By the time she reached the staff lounge, a fresh pot of coffee had just been brewed. Someone had labeled it, "For Dr. Miller, no cream, no sugar." She smiled, a real one this time. Not because it was nostalgic, but because someone had remembered. Not a patient, not a board member, someone in the present. She didn't agree to return right away. She didn't need the position to reclaim anything. She had already reclaimed something deeper: presence. Her story, once redacted by politics and fear, had found its way back, not because she demanded it, but because someone else remembered how much it had shaped them. And in medicine, that's legacy. Not the speeches, not the titles, but the hands that learned from yours. The decisions are shaped by your ethics. On her last day before flying back to Finland to settle things one final time, Grace walked down that familiar corridor again. This time, she was alone. She stood before the Wall of Honor for a few moments longer than necessary. And then, almost casually, she reached into her coat and placed a small folded card at the foot of the wall, right below her name. It read, "To the next student who thinks no one sees them, we do. We always have. You don't need noise to leave a mark, just the truth. Just care." She didn't wait to see who picked it up. She walked away, not as a ghost, not as a footnote, but as someone whose silence had been broken by something better than headlines, recognition from those who mattered, and peace with herself. The taxi pulled up quietly in front of the modest brick building. No one noticed her step out. No cameras, no parade. Just the soft click of heels on winter pavement and the soft breath of city air whispering through the alley. Grace Miller stood at the threshold of the apartment she had left behind a decade ago. The key still turned the same way, one gentle twist, one deliberate push. The door opened with a soft groan, like it too remembered. The space inside was small, almost stark. Scandinavian in its simplicity, shaped by years of quiet living in Finland. One bookshelf, one desk, a weathered armchair by the window. No photos on the walls, no certificates framed in gold. Just silence and space, and the faint scent of old paper and strong coffee. She didn't unpack. Not right away. Instead, she walked to the bookshelf, the one she hadn't touched in years. The shelf sagged slightly in the middle from the weight of old lecture binders, research manuscripts and journals with her name buried in the byline. She ran her hand over the spines like they were old friends she no longer knew how to greet. Her fingers stopped at a small, unmarked folder, tucked between her 2007 trauma surgery manual and a Finnish English dictionary. She slid it out slowly. Inside, a single handwritten letter. The ink slightly faded, the edges yellowed by time and humidity. She recognized the handwriting instantly her own, but softer. Written during the first month after everything fell apart. She sat in the chair, unfolded it carefully, and read. If someone finds this, it's probably because I never sent it. That's fine. Not everything needs to be said out loud. People think silence means surrender. That if you don't speak, you've accepted their version of the truth. But silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's knowing your worth isn't up for debate. I didn't leave because I lost. I left because I refused to stay where they only valued the noise, not the substance. If anyone still remembers me, I don't need to be honored. I just hope they understand I never needed to be loud to be right. Her throat tightened as she finished reading. She had forgotten she'd ever written it. Forgotten the version of herself who still needed to explain why she disappeared. But now, sitting there a decade later, she realized something. She no longer needed the letter. Because someone had remembered. Someone had seen her. Not the version sculpted by rumors or redacted reports, but the real Grace, the one who quietly shaped minds, who didn't need applause to be relevant, who had once taught the very hands that now held scalpels in the best hospitals in the country. She stood up and walked to the kitchen. Made herself coffee the way she always had, strong, no sugar, just heat and clarity. The silence in the room wasn't empty anymore. It was whole. It held memory, meaning. Across the room, her phone buzzed, a rare occurrence. It was a message from Lucas Rains. Heading into a complicated procedure tomorrow. Rereading your vascular flow failover lecture notes. Still gold. Thought you should know. She smiled, not for the praise, but for the understanding. He hadn't called her professor. Not Dr. Miller, just Grace. And somehow that was enough. She went to bed early that night, the city soft outside her window. From her bed she could see the bookshelf, the desk, and the envelope, now resting back in its folder. But she knew something had shifted. The letter once meant to justify her silence no longer carried weight. Because she wasn't silent anymore. She had simply stopped shouting into rooms that refused to listen. Now her voice lived in others, in students who quoted her without knowing her face, in surgeons who still referenced her slides during emergencies, in a young woman at a ceremony who said, "You weren't gone. You were just ahead." The next morning, as sunlight spread across her windowsill, Grace opened her laptop. Not to search her name, not to follow the aftermath of the ceremony, just to check her email. Among the routine faculty notices and medical journal updates, there was one new message from admin@lund.edu. Subject guest lecturer, invitation, Advanced Surgical Ethics Seminar, spring term. At the bottom, a simple line. We would be honored to have you back, even for one session. She closed the laptop. Let it sit for a moment. And then, without a second thought, she replied, yes. But only if the students bring questions. I'm done giving answers to people who've already made up their minds. She hit send, then stood up, pulled the curtains open, and let the light fully in. Because sometimes the return isn't loud. It's not a headline. It's not even a reunion. It's a whisper in the right room. A name is placed back where it belongs. A truth no longer hidden. And a woman who once left the world of surgery is now stepping back, not to prove anything, just to keep teaching. Because some voices are quiet for a reason. Not because they were afraid, but because they were never wrong to begin with. The lecture room smelled faintly of antiseptic and chalk dust, an odd blend of old and new. Rows of surgical tables gleamed beneath white fluorescent lights. Simulated torsos lay open for practice, surrounded by clusters of young med students in white coats, far too crisp for anyone who had ever stepped into a real OR. At the very back of the room, seated on a modest folding chair, was Dr. Grace Miller. No badge, no lab coat. Just a simple, dark sweater hair, pinned back, eyes quiet but focused. She didn't introduce herself, didn't take the spotlight. She was just there, watching. Professor Liam Adler, once a student of Grace's student, now stood at the front of the room giving precise instructions about cerebral aneurysm clipping. The students scribbled, nodded, some too nervous to breathe. She remembered this feeling. The first time she had taught a room like this, half the class didn't even know what a retractor was. Now they recited Latin terms like gospel and adjusted microsurgical lenses with practiced grace. Grace sat with her hands folded on her lap, not taking notes, not correcting anyone, just listening, learning again in a way. One of the younger students, a girl with a nervous bounce in her knee and determination in her brow, glanced back toward Grace and whispered to her friend across the table. "Hey, see her?" Her friend barely nodded, too focused on a vascular chart. The girl leaned in. "I heard she used to be the best, like legendary." But then she just vanished. Grace heard every word, but she didn't flinch. Her hands stayed calmly together, fingers gently laced like folded pages of a closed book. She didn't turn around, didn't correct them, didn't explain who she was. She didn't need to. Instead, she slowly rose from the chair as the class neared the end of its session. Quietly, she walked toward the edge of the whiteboard near the exit. The students were still focused on their mock surgeries, their scalpel techniques, their diagrams. None of them noticed her reach for a marker. She wrote only one line, just 7 words. "Impact doesn't shout, it echoes." Then she placed the marker back in its holder, picked up her bag, and left the room as silently as she had entered. The quote stayed on the board for hours. Long after the students left and the janitor wiped the rest of the board clean, those words remained undisturbed. The young girl from earlier came back later that evening for her notebook and froze when she saw it. She stared at the words for a long time. Then slowly, almost reverently, she pulled out her phone and snapped a photo. She didn't know why. She just knew it mattered. She didn't know that the woman who wrote it once developed the vascular flow model that saved her uncle's life 3 years ago. She didn't know that the silent visitor at the back of the room once trained the surgeon who operated on her friend's brain tumor, or that her residency program's emergency trauma protocol still bore the hallmarks of Dr. Miller's original design. She didn't know, and maybe she didn't need to, because echoes don't ask to be recognized. They're just felt long after the sound is gone. A week later, that same whiteboard quote made its way onto the hospital's internal bulletin board. No signature, no context, just taped there under the weekly rotation schedule, like a whisper tucked inside bureaucracy. Doctors passed it on their way to rounds. A few paused, a few smiled. One of the older surgeons stared at it for nearly 5 minutes before walking away with his hands in his pockets and something tender in his eyes. Back at home, Grace received no awards, no headlines, no call from the dean, just a package on her doorstep. Inside was a letter, handwritten in careful cursive. "I don't know if you remember me. I was a first-year student when you taught the ethics elective in Finland. You told us not to chase applause, to chase precision and humility. I never forgot. This year I became the lead surgeon on a case I never thought I'd be ready for. But I was, because of you." At the bottom, a small Polaroid photo of a surgery team holding up their fingers in the shape of a G for Grace. No caption, just people she never posted with, never stood beside, but who had still carried her lessons into their chapters. Sometimes legacy isn't built in grand speeches. Sometimes it's built in the echo of unspoken gratitude, in the hands of students who now teach others, in the way your words become someone else's turning point, even if they never know your name. Grace made tea that night, not coffee. She was learning to let the sharpness go. She sat by the window, the soft hum of the city rising and falling like breath. She watched lights flicker in apartments across the street, lives going on, unbothered by spotlights or silence. She sipped her tea and smiled, because she finally understood something she'd always taught but only now fully believed. You don't have to be seen to make a difference. You just have to keep showing up even quietly. Because some truths echo, and the loudest legacies, they never shout, they linger.